Agnes Waruguru. I'm a visual artist based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I work across multiple mediums. Yes, when I'm working, I do feel like material influences what the direction of work will be. I do, for example, when I'm working on paper versus textile, the feeling of the work is really different. What I'm able to achieve with the textures and materials does provide a different feeling to the work, and sometimes also influence each other. Yes, I feel I've really gotten to experiment with many different types of cotton and also different types of paper. Recently I started using Yupo because of how it allows me to work the material more and collect the colors and water in a different way than watercolor paper, for example. There are definitely materials that respond differently than I expect, but I feel like a big part of my practice is actually embracing the unknown and trying to work together with materials. Sometimes I feel like the material guides me to understand what the possibilities of the work could be, and sometimes those surprises are what leads me to new ways of making. For example, lately I've been printing on paper, kind of monoprints, using fabric to print on paper, and that just happened because I have a practice of laying paper on the ground in my studio, and when I'm making textile works, I lay those on top of my studio floor to dry, and I started to develop this practice of making prints. I think something that keeps coming up for me is definitely my choice of substrate. Like over the years, I do feel like the core of my practice remains the same, but the way that the different topics enter that subject. So like using textiles, initially I started because I was really interested with ideas surrounding the home, and I wanted to have something that was a cultural identifier immediately in my work. And now I'm using more plain cottons to talk more about water and environment, but it still has that connection to what is familiar to us, something soft, something gentle, something related to the body. So yeah, I do feel like textile is something I continuously go back to, and also different ways of making that I've learned, from childhood, even like picking up a charcoal stick or pastels, or going back to embroidery, even though the core idea or the outright idea that I want you to experience is different. The ways of making kind of remain the same and transform as I'm thinking about different things. I feel like towards the end of the making of the work, so for me, I begin making work by, I feel my work is really influenced by my everyday life, and that's where the themes of the work come in. For example, like recently I've really been thinking about how to talk about grief in my work and how to make spaces for meditation and spaces that could hold a stillness, a quietness related to grief, because that's what I was going through in my personal life. And it took some time to research, to go through those emotions. And by the time I'm in the studio making works, the final decisions are definitely ones of, composition, color, what's the feeling of the work, rather than, I guess, the research or, yeah. I definitely work in a more experimental way. I do feel like my materials influence the outcome of the work, and also I'm experimenting with so many different materials like glass, ceramic, natural pigment making. And so I do feel I have less control over everything in the studio, and most of the time the surprises of how different inks and natural pigments mix together, that's actually what makes the work come alive for me and what makes the process of making work worthwhile. I work on multiple works at the same time, so I kind of feel that the works make each other, and I typically work on something for quite a while. I do feel the beginning of the work is really quick. The initial setting up the base of the work is really quick, and then coming in to do drawings or embroidery takes a much longer time. So I already get the feeling of the work quite quickly, and then I know how to react based on those happy accidents or experiments that happened initially. I can now form it into something more intentional in the drawing and embroidery and embellishment stage. I think most definitely. Sometimes I view works that I made, I guess, at the very beginning of my career, and I see different things than what I intended when I first made them. I feel like the work always has a chance to continue growing and changing, even based on where it's exhibited, how the audience reacts to it. I always feel that I see something I hadn't seen before, and the work can really become different based on the context of where it's shown and how it's shown. From the studio to a gallery or museum or a home, it really can change the work. Yeah, I feel like one of the times when I made a mistake that has now become kind of a core way of making is mixing Indian ink with a lot of water. They really don't interact well together, and the ink tends to separate and break down. And that's something that you can see in most of my pieces. It's an experiment that an accident that happened that I've really fully embraced. Sometimes I have works that I feel are unsuccessful, maybe because they're unbalanced in composition or feel unfinished, but I can't quite pinpoint what the issue is. I typically tend to cut these up and use them to collage and make new works. I will make quilted works with fabric or make hanging cutouts from works that I felt are unsuccessful. So I feel like that's a way of revising. Yes, I do feel more confident with the materials I use now, as I've become really close with the ways of making that I engage in. For example, with the natural pigments, I feel it's quite an unpredictable process. but I've been able to kind of understand what different plants and seeds can produce and how far I can push it by experimenting, with different amounts of chemicals, different weights of cotton. So I do feel like the more that I experiment and make those, come across happy accidents and record the process, then I have a much better understanding of what I'm working with and how I can use that material in the way that I want to. I do feel that there are parts of the work that are better experienced than described. For example, the delicate nature of the work, I think is really something that one has to experience in person. I typically tend to make really small drawings inside larger drawings. I think this is also something that is better seen than explained or even shown in like detailed images. As the more you spend time with the work, the more it reveals to you. I think also working on many different scales, seeing a picture of a work that is 6 meters long versus experiencing it is very different. I do feel like there is a part of the work that is really about how it makes you feel in a space, how the space is curated for you to experience the work and become part of the work. I think recently thinking a lot about spaces for meditation and stillness and almost a sense of quietness. I do feel this is something that is experienced when I'm able to make like a full installation and affect a whole space to share this idea. I think it's easily spoken about, but it is more impactful to feel it in a space and really have that stillness brought to you from experiencing the work. So I recently got the chance to show a work at the Venice Biennial, the last edition, and it was an amazing experience. I showed a work called Incomprehensible Weather in the Head, and this was a large-scale textile work that kind of was showing the idea of moving through a landscape in different times of the day and how different people experience space and how we weave through similar spaces. It has definitely been a milestone for me to be able to show at this exhibition and show together with so many brilliant artists and an amazing curator. And I loved it, and I hope one day to show there again. I feel like the ARAK collection is quite amazing with having such an extensive collection of African artists. For me, it's quite special because from the beginning of when I started thinking about landscapes and how landscapes affect people, I think there's quite a good breadth of work that shows where the genesis of these thoughts and how they're translated until today. And I really feel like the work that is being done there is really important, to archive, writing about different artists on the continent. For me, it's a great resource, and I'm really happy to be part of the collection.